In this heartfelt story, a billionaire's chance encounter with a homeless female veteran challenges everything he thought he knew about success, resilience, and the meaning of service. When her unwavering spirit inspires him to act, will their unlikely partnership transform lives, or is the battle too steep to overcome? Subscribe and share where you're watching from, as we celebrate this powerful story of courage, compassion, and hope. Daniel Carter's leather shoes clicked against the uneven pavement, each step purposeful, radiating confidence. He wasn't the kind of man who looked twice at anything, or anyone. That didn't serve his bottom line. Today was no different. He was focused on the next board meeting, where he would secure a deal worth millions, one that would solidify Carter Enterprises as a global powerhouse. Then he saw her. She sat on the edge of a bench just outside the park, her back straight despite the layers of faded clothing hanging loosely on her frame. In her lap was a cardboard sign scrawled with blocky, uneven handwriting. "Veteran in need. Please help." Her eyes weren't pleading, though. They were sharp, scanning the crowd with a mix of detachment and quiet observation. Daniel slowed his pace, his curiosity snagged like a thread caught on a nail. Something about her felt different. She didn't exude the desperation he'd come to expect from the countless people who lined the streets of New York City with similar signs. She wasn't shaking a cup of change or muttering a string of apologies to passers-by. She was just there, solid and steady, as though the bench were a throne and she the queen of this chaotic little corner of the city. It was the dog tags around her neck that sealed it, faintly scuffed. They gleamed in the midday sun as she shifted to pull her tattered jacket closer against the chill. Daniel hesitated, glancing at his Rolex out of habit. 8 minutes until the car arrived to whisk him away to his next meeting. He could just keep walking, hundreds of people already had. Yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he stopped. "Army or Marines?" he asked, his tone brisk but curious. Her gaze flicked up, assessing him with the precision of someone who had spent years sizing up people in an instant. "Army," she replied. Her voice was even, steady, with no trace of defensiveness or invitation. "You don't look like you belong out here," he said without thinking. Her lips quirked in a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. "Funny. I was just thinking the same about you." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. He had expected either silence or gratitude. Not this. "You're a veteran," he pressed, nodding at the dog tags. "Emily Parker," she said simply. "I served. Now I don't." Her eyes held his for a moment, then dipped back to the chessboard of feet and legs passing her by. For the first time in years, Daniel felt insignificant. "Do you need anything?" he asked, unsure why he even cared. She gestured at the sign. "That's why it's there." He frowned. Her answer wasn't curt, it was matter-of-fact, but beneath her calm exterior Daniel could sense a story, one that was deeper than a cardboard plea for help. Daniel couldn't shake the encounter. Emily Parker, Army veteran. The name and the brief conversation replayed in his mind as his private car glided through the city. She hadn't asked for anything more than the words on her sign. No desperation, no attempt to manipulate his pity. She simply existed in a way that unsettled him. His driver, Aaron, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You all right, Mr. Carter? You've been quiet since the park." "I'm fine," Daniel replied curtly, shifting his focus to his phone. But the emails and notifications blurred together. His mind was somewhere else entirely. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm, meetings, presentations, power lunches, but Emily's steady gaze lingered in his thoughts like an itch he couldn't scratch. By evening, he found himself seated in his office, staring out at the glittering skyline of Manhattan, his reflection in the glass layered over the vibrant city below. "Do I care?" he muttered to himself. The last time Daniel had thought about veterans was during a charity gala for a cause he barely remembered. He had written a check, posed for photos, and moved on. Yet Emily with her unshakable calm and faded dog tags, had stirred something in him that no glossy charity event ever had. Reaching for his phone, he hesitated. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to do. After a long moment, he made the call. "Aaron, get the car ready. We're heading back to the park." Emily sat exactly where he had seen her earlier, as if she hadn't moved all day. A steaming cup of coffee rested on the bench beside her, likely from one of the kind strangers who occasionally passed by. Daniel approached, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. This time her gaze lifted as he drew near, her expression mildly curious but guarded. "You came back," she said, her tone neutral. Daniel shrugged, his hands in his coat pockets. "Couldn't get our conversation out of my head." Her eyebrow arched. "Most people don't give me a second thought." "I'm not most people," he replied. It sounded arrogant, even to his ears, but he didn't retract it. Emily regarded him for a moment before gesturing to the bench. "Sit, then." Daniel hesitated. The bench was scuffed and weathered, far removed from the pristine conference chairs and leather seats he was used to. Still, he sat. "I want to understand," he said after a pause. "How does someone like you end up here?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think I'm a puzzle to solve?" "No," he said quickly. "But I think you have a story worth hearing." She studied him, the silence stretching between them. Finally she nodded. "All right, but only if you're actually listening. No interruptions, no judgments." "I can do that." For the next hour, Emily spoke. She told him about her deployments, the bonds she had formed with her unit, and the battles she had faced long after leaving the field. She explained the relentless bureaucracy, the stigma of mental health struggles, and the... Daniel listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. When she finished, he found himself at a loss for words. "Lot," he finally said. Emily smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It is." For the first time, Daniel realized his world of deals and profits had left him blind to a much larger battlefield, one being fought right outside his glossy office towers. And Emily, sitting on this battered bench, was a soldier he had no idea how to help. Daniel arrived at his penthouse later that night, the echoes of Emily's story following him into the sterile, modern space. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, but for once, the city's brilliance felt hollow. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood in the dimly lit room, her voice still vivid in his mind. "Jobs I was overqualified for wouldn't even call me back," she'd said. "My skills didn't translate, they told me. My record didn't matter. Neither did I." It was the kind of story Daniel had heard in passing, usually on some impersonal news segment, but it had never hit him like this. Emily was real. Her calm defiance had burned through his detachment like a laser. The next morning he called his assistant, Claire, as he sipped his coffee. "I need you to find someone," Daniel said, his tone brisk. "Of course, Mr. Carter. A potential hire?" "Not exactly. A veteran named Emily Parker. She's homeless, probably still near the park I mentioned yesterday." Claire hesitated. "You want me to?" "Just find her, Claire. I'll take care of the rest." 2 hours later, Daniel stepped out of his car onto the familiar stretch of sidewalk. Emily was still there, though she had shifted to sit cross-legged on the ground, focused on a tattered journal in her lap. When she noticed him, her brow furrowed in faint confusion. "You really like making a habit of this, don't you?" she asked as he approached. "I'm persistent," Daniel replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. He gestured to the journal. "What are you working on?" She hesitated, then closed the book protectively. "Just some notes." "Notes for what?" Emily stood, brushing dust off her hands. "Look, Daniel, if you came here to keep poking at my life, I'm not interested in being someone's pity project." "It's not pity," he said quickly. "I want to help." Emily crossed her arms, her sharp gaze narrowing. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I can. and because you deserve better than this." "That's not enough," she said, shaking her head. "You don't get to swoop in and fix everything with a checkbook." "Then tell me how I can help," he said, his voice firm. "What do you need?" She studied him, the silence stretching. Finally she sighed. "I don't need handouts. I need opportunities. A chance to stand on my own again." Daniel nodded. "Done. You'll have a job by tomorrow, and not some desk job you'll hate. Something that fits your skills." Emily blinked, clearly caught off guard by the offer. "You don't even know what I'm good at. Tell me and I'll make it happen." A long pause followed, then she smirked. "All right, Mr. Carter, but I'm holding you to that promise." As she walked away, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. He didn't just want to help Emily, he wanted to prove to himself that he could. And this was just the beginning. The next week was a whirlwind. True to his word, Daniel secured Emily a position within his company, a role in logistics that utilized her sharp organizational skills and experience coordinating under pressure. To her surprise, it wasn't charity. It was an honest job with clear expectations and a fair salary. Emily adapted quickly, blending into the office environment with quiet determination. Her military discipline shone through, but she avoided small talk and kept her head down. Daniel watched from a distance, respecting her boundaries while quietly rooting for her success. Late one evening, Daniel stepped into the office's break room, surprised to find Emily there. She sat at a table with her journal, flipping through its worn pages. A coffee cup, its logo from a nearby veterans shelter, rested beside her. She didn't notice him at first, her focus laser-sharp on whatever she was reading. "You work late," he said, breaking the silence. Emily looked up, momentarily startled. "So do you," she countered, closing the journal. Daniel approached cautiously. "What's in the book?" "It's nothing," she said quickly, but the edge in her voice piqued his curiosity. "If it's nothing, why are you so protective of it?" he pressed, sitting across from her. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she opened the journal to a page filled with neat sketches and notes. Daniel leaned in, scanning the words and diagrams. They weren't random musings. They were detailed plans for a community shelter. Ideas for programs, sketches of layouts, and handwritten notes about resources filled the pages. "This is incredible," Daniel said, genuinely impressed. "You've been working on this the whole time?" Emily shrugged, her expression guarded. "It's just a dream, something I started working on after my first night in a shelter. I've seen too many vets slip through the cracks. We need a place that actually helps." "And you've been doing this on your own?" She nodded. "I've been volunteering at the shelter in my spare time, listening to people, gathering ideas, but it's not like I have the money or influence to make it real." Daniel sat back, digesting her words. For the first time, he understood the scope of her determination. Emily wasn't just surviving. She was fighting to create something bigger than herself. "You do now," he said firmly. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I can fund this," Daniel said. "We'll make it real. Together." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping in. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Daniel replied, "and because you've shown me what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. Let me help." Emily stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but this isn't about you swooping in as the hero. If we do this, I'm in charge." Daniel smiled. "Deal." In that moment, he realized something profound. Emily wasn't just changing her life, she was transforming his, one unshakable step at a time. And for once, he was ready to follow someone else's lead. The hum of activity filled the newly refurbished community center, its halls buzzing with life. Veterans chatted over coffee in the common room, others reviewed their resumes in the career support office, and a small group gathered in the therapy room, speaking with a counselor. The name of the center, Parker's Haven, gleamed proudly on a polished plaque near the entrance. It was Emily's name, Emily's vision, and Daniel had made sure everyone knew it. At night, Emily stood by the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the room with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Her once tattered journal now sat on the reception desk, a symbol of how far they had come. It was no longer just a dream, it was a reality. "You're making a difference," Daniel said as he approached her, a cup of coffee in each hand. He offered her one, and she accepted with a faint smile. "I couldn't have done it without your resources," she said, but her tone wasn't deferential. It was a statement of fact. "And I couldn't have done it without your vision," Daniel countered. "You brought this to life, Emily. This is yours." Emily glanced around the room, her gaze settling on a young man in a wheelchair, laughing with two older veterans. The sight brought a flicker of emotion to her usually composed face. "I just wanted them to have what I didn't, a real shot." "They'll get it here," Daniel said. "Because of you." Over the next few weeks, Parker's Haven became a beacon for veterans across the city. Daniel was often there, not just as a benefactor, but as an active participant. He met the people Emily was helping, listened to their stories, and realized how blind he'd been to their struggle. One evening, after the last of the visitors had left, Daniel found Emily cleaning up the center's main room. She moved with a quiet determination, stacking chairs and wiping down tables. "You don't have to do that," he said, stepping in to help. Emily smirked. "Old habits die hard. Can't sit still when there's work to be done." As they worked, Daniel asked, "Did you ever think it would come to this?" Emily paused, her hands resting on the back of a chair. "Honestly? No. For a long time I thought this would just stay in my journal, something to dream about when I couldn't sleep." Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "You're a leader, Emily. More than I ever was." She laughed lightly. "You're giving me too much credit." "No," he said firmly. "I've built businesses, made deals. But this, what you're doing, it's real. It's changing lives, including mine." Emily studied him, her expression softening. "You've changed too, you know. The guy I met on that bench wouldn't have cared about this." Daniel smiled. "That guy was an idiot." She chuckled. "I won't argue with that." As the night wore on, the two of them sat at one of the tables, the empty center quiet around them. Emily sipped her coffee, and Daniel leaned back, his gaze distant but content. "What's next?" he asked. Emily thought for a moment. "There's always more to do, more people to help. But for now," she gestured around them, "this is a good start." Daniel nodded. For now. In the stillness of the moment, Daniel realized he'd gained more than he'd given. Emily had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or boardroom victories, but in the lives you touched and the legacy you left behind. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt truly rich. Parker's Haven was thriving, but its rapid success did not go unnoticed. Local bureaucrats, skeptical neighbors, and a few outspoken critics began to stir, questioning everything from zoning permits to the sudden influx of veterans in their community. At first, Emily dismissed the noise, too focused on the work at hand. But as the complaints grew louder, it became clear this wasn't going away. The breaking point came when Emily received a notice from the city council. A formal investigation had been launched into Parker's Haven, citing vague accusations about safety concerns and unauthorized activities. The letter was cold and impersonal, but its implications were clear. Someone wanted them shut down. Emily slammed the letter onto Daniel's desk in his office, her jaw tight with frustration. "This is ridiculous," she said, pacing. "Everything we've done is above board. They're just trying to scare us." Daniel leaned back in his chair, scanning the letter with a frown. "They're not trying to scare us. They're trying to stall us. The longer this investigation drags on, the harder it'll be to keep the center running." "They don't want us here," Emily said bitterly. "All they see is a group of problematic veterans disrupting their perfect little bubble." Daniel set the letter down, his expression hardening. then we'll fight back. The next few weeks were a storm of meetings, paperwork, and public appearances. Emily found herself in unfamiliar territory, standing at podiums and speaking at town halls. She was no stranger to conflict, but this was a different kind of battle, one waged with words, not weapons. At one particularly heated town hall meeting, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit stood up, his voice cutting through the room. "We're not against helping veterans," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But this center is bringing in people who might pose a risk to our community. How can we be sure our families are safe?" The room murmured in agreement, and Emily felt her stomach twist. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands steady despite the tension. "Sir," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I served this country for over a decade. So did the men and women you're talking about. We didn't risk our lives overseas to come home and be treated like threats in our own neighborhood." The man opened his mouth to retort, but Emily raised her hand, cutting him off. "You want guarantees? Here's one. Parker's Haven is about giving people a chance to rebuild their lives. If you can't see that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out. It spread, growing louder, until the hall was filled with the sound of support. Emily glanced at Daniel, who gave her a small nod of approval from the back of the room. Later that evening, back at the center, Emily slumped into a chair, exhausted. Daniel sat across from her, a rare look of admiration on his face. "You were incredible tonight," he said. "I was just honest," she replied, rubbing her temples. "But this isn't over." "No," Daniel agreed. "But you showed them who you are. That's more than half the battle." Emily looked up, her resolve hardening. "They can try to shut us down, but they're going to find out just how stubborn I can be." Daniel smiled. "Good, because I'm just as stubborn." As they strategized late into the night, Emily realized she wasn't fighting this battle alone. For the first time in years, she felt like part of a team again, a feeling she hadn't known she missed until now. And together, she and Daniel would ensure Parker's Haven stood as a testament to resilience and justice. And the investigation into Parker's Haven cast a shadow over the center, but Emily and Daniel refused to let it slow their progress. If anything, the opposition only galvanized them. Emily decided they needed more than just town hall speeches. They needed a community that was ready to fight alongside them. The next morning, she arrived at Daniel's office with a plan. She spread a series of hand-drawn flyers across his desk, the bold lettering reading, "Stand with our veterans. Parker's Haven needs you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Grassroots organizing?" Emily nodded. "People need to see what this place really stands for. We've been focused on doing the work, but we haven't been loud enough about why it matters." Daniel picked up one of the flyers, admiring its simplicity. "We'll need more than paper, social media, press coverage, events. If we want to turn this around, we need to go big." Emily grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel tapped into his vast network, arranging interviews with local news outlets and leveraging social media platforms to spread their message. Emily, reluctant at first, found herself speaking in front of cameras, sharing her story with a raw honesty that captivated audiences. One clip in particular went viral. Standing in front of Parker's Haven, Emily addressed the camera with a determined gaze. "I didn't fight for this country so I could come home and watch my brothers and sisters be forgotten. Parker's Haven isn't just a shelter. It's a promise that we won't leave anyone behind. If you believe in that, if you believe in what this country stands for, we need you." The video garnered thousands of views within hours, and soon messages of support poured in from across the nation. Veterans shared their own stories in the comments, and local businesses began offering donations to support the center. The turning point came during an open house event at Parker's Haven. Dozens of people from the community showed up, including veterans, their families, and even some of the center's initial critics. Emily greeted each person personally, guiding them through the center's facilities and explaining its mission. In one corner of the common room, a young veteran shared his story with a group of visitors. "I was lost before I came here," he said, his voice wavering. "They gave me a chance to start over, a chance I didn't think I deserved." Hearing his words, one of the visitors, a local council member who had originally opposed the center, pulled Daniel aside. "I didn't realize the impact this place was having," she admitted. "Maybe I was too quick to judge." Daniel seized the opportunity. "It's not just about what Parker's Haven does, it's about what it represents. People want to help, but they need to know how. That's what Emily is giving them." The council member nodded thoughtfully. "I'll see what I can do to support you." By the end of the night, Emily and Daniel stood outside the center, watching as the last visitors trickled out. The glow of the building's lights felt warmer, brighter, as if reflecting the renewed hope inside. "We did it," Emily said softly. Daniel shook his head. "You did it. They're not just rallying behind Parker's Haven. They're rallying behind you." Emily looked at him, the weight of the day beginning to lift. "We're not done yet." "No," Daniel agreed, a smile tugging at his lips. "But tonight, we celebrate." As they stood side by side, the buzz of new possibilities filled the air. The community had spoken, and their message was clear. Parker's Haven wasn't just a center, it was a symbol of resilience, hope, and the unwavering belief that no one should be left behind. The momentum from the open house carried Parker's Haven into the public spotlight, and for a while it seemed as though nothing could stop their progress. Donations poured in, volunteers flocked to the center, and even some of their initial critics began to change their tune. Emily felt, for the first time in years, a glimmer of optimism. But success has a way of drawing out enemies. Late one evening, Emily was in her office, reviewing plans for expanding the center's vocational training programs. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet. It was Daniel. "You need to get down here," he said, his voice tight. "Where?" Emily asked, already grabbing her coat. "The center? Someone vandalized it?" When Emily arrived, her heart sank. Spray-painted graffiti covered the front of the building, vulgar phrases mixed with accusations like freeloaders and not in our neighborhood. Windows were shattered, and the garden, a point of pride for many of the veterans, was trampled and destroyed. A small crowd had gathered, whispering and pointing. Some of the veterans stood off to the side, their expressions a mix of anger and despair. Daniel was already there, speaking with a police officer. When he saw Emily, he broke away and approached. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. The cameras caught some footage of the vandals, but they were wearing masks. Emily stared at the damage, her hands clenched into fists. "This wasn't just random," she said. "They wanted to send a message." Daniel nodded grimly. "We'll clean this up, but we need to be careful. Whoever did this might not stop here." The next morning, Emily called an emergency meeting with the staff and volunteers. The room was tense, the air thick with frustration. A few veterans voiced their doubts, questioning whether it was worth continuing if the community they were trying to serve didn't want them there. Emily stood at the front of the room, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this is hard," she began. "I know it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. But this isn't just about Parker's Haven. It's about what it stands for. They want us to back down because they're afraid of change, afraid of what we represent." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I didn't give up when things got hard overseas, and I'm not giving up now. Are you?" One by one, heads began to nod. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Daniel, standing in the back, watched with quiet admiration as Emily transformed their anger into resolve. Within hours, the center was buzzing with activity. Volunteers scrubbed the walls, cleaned the broken glass, and began replanting the garden. Local businesses offered supplies, and even strangers stopped by to lend a hand. The vandalism, meant to intimidate, had instead brought the community closer together. That evening, as Emily and Daniel surveyed the now pristine building, she let out a weary sigh. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Daniel shook his head. "Probably not. But they underestimated you and us. Shaw said. Emily smiled faintly. Good. Let them try. The attack on Parker's Haven became a rallying cry for supporters. Local media picked up the story, painting the center not as a target, but as a symbol of resilience. Donations increased, and more veterans came forward to share their stories, inspired by Emily's leadership. But even as they rebuilt, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. For every step forward, there were forces ready to pull them back. Yet, as she looked around at the determined faces of her team, she knew one thing for certain. They would face whatever came next, together. The vandalism had been a wake-up call for Emily and Daniel, but instead of retreating, they doubled down on their efforts to solidify Parker's Haven as an unshakable force in the community. Emily, driven by a renewed sense of purpose, decided it was time to take the fight to a larger platform. "We need to go national," she said one evening in Daniel's office, her voice firm. Daniel looked up from his laptop, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Emily paced the room, her energy palpable. "I mean we need to tell our story, not just to this city, but to the entire country. Veterans like the ones we're helping are everywhere. If people can see what Parker's Haven is doing, maybe we can inspire others to take action too." Daniel leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming. "I like it. But how do we do it?" "Media," Emily replied without hesitation. "Not just local outlets. Big ones. National networks, podcasts, whatever it takes. I'll tell my story, and we'll get other veterans to share theirs." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Daniel used his connections to arrange interviews with major news outlets, while Emily prepared herself for the intense spotlight. She was hesitant at first. Her instincts told her to avoid the kind of attention that could easily become performative. But the stakes were too high to let her discomfort hold her back. Her first big interview was with a national morning show. Sitting under the harsh studio lights, Emily faced the cameras with a calm, quiet strength that commanded attention. "Emily," the host began, "you've been called the heart of Parker's Haven. Can you tell us why this mission means so much to you?" Emily nodded, her voice steady. "When I left the army, I thought my hardest battles were behind me. But coming home was its own war, one I wasn't prepared for. I struggled to find my place, to feel like I mattered again. Parker's Haven isn't just a shelter, it's a lifeline. It's a way to show veterans that they're not forgotten." The host leaned forward, clearly moved. "And what do you hope to achieve with Parker's Haven?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "Change, not just for the veterans we help, but for how our country sees them. They gave everything for this nation. It's time we gave something back." The interview went viral. Clips circulated across social media, sparking conversations about veteran homelessness and reintegration. Donations surged, but more importantly, messages of support flooded in from across the nation. Veterans reached out, sharing their struggles and asking how they could get involved. Community leaders in other cities expressed interest in replicating Parker's Haven in their areas. One evening, as Emily reviewed the influx of emails in the center's small office, Daniel walked in with a printed letter in hand. "You're not going to believe this," he said, handing it to her. Emily scanned the letter, her eyes widening. It was an invitation to testify before a congressional committee on veteran affairs. They wanted her to speak about Parker's Haven and propose ways to address systemic issues affecting veterans nationwide. This is huge," Emily murmured. Daniel nodded. "It's the chance to take everything you've been fighting for and make it bigger than any of us imagined." Emily sat down, the weight of the opportunity settling over her. "It's not just about what we're doing here, it's about making sure no veteran ever feels like they're fighting alone." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "And if anyone can make them listen, it's you." As Emily prepared for the hearing, she knew the stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time she didn't feel alone in the fight. Parker's Haven had become more than a center, it was a movement, and now she had the chance to take that movement to the halls of power, to fight for every veteran who deserved a second chance. The day of the congressional hearing arrived, and the weight of the moment was undeniable. Emily stood in the hallway outside the chamber, dressed in a simple but professional outfit. Her dog tags, polished to a soft gleam, rested against her chest, a quiet reminder of her journey. Daniel was beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked. Emily took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs as the committee prepared to hear testimony. Cameras lined the back walls, journalists scribbled notes, and rows of spectators, many of them veterans, sat in tense anticipation. When Emily's name was called, she rose from her seat and approached the microphone. Her opening words were calm and deliberate. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Emily Parker. I served in the United States Army for over a decade, but today I'm here as an advocate for veterans who are still fighting battles long after they've left the field." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the committee members. "When I came home, I thought I was prepared for civilian life, but I wasn't prepared for the roadblocks, employers dismissing my experience, a system that seemed more interested in paperwork than people, and the isolation that comes with feeling invisible. I'm not alone in this. Millions of veterans face the same struggles every day." Emily shared stories from Parker's Haven, of the young Marine who learned how to code and landed his first job in years, of the Vietnam veteran who finally found a community that understood him. She spoke of the vandalism, the opposition, and the resilience it had sparked. "This isn't just about one center," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about creating a system that values the men and women who have given so much to this country. We need more funding for veteran programs, better mental health resources, and a commitment to ensuring no one falls through the cracks." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, one by one, the committee members began to applaud. It wasn't customary, but the impact of her testimony was undeniable. That evening, back at Parker's Haven, the atmosphere was electric. The veterans, staff, and volunteers gathered to watch the news coverage of Emily's testimony. Clips of her speech played on every major network, accompanied by commentary praising her courage and clarity. Emily sat quietly in the corner, a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction settling over her. Daniel approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said, handing her one. "We did it," she corrected. "This was never just about me." Daniel smiled. "The world's watching now. They can't ignore us anymore." As the crowd around them erupted into cheers, celebrating the success of Parker's Haven and the hope it symbolized, Emily allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The journey from a weathered bench in a city park to the halls of Congress had been anything but easy. But it had been worth it. Months later, Parker's Haven had grown beyond anything Emily or Daniel could have imagined. New centers were opening in other cities, inspired by their model. Policies were being discussed on Capitol Hill, spurred by Emily's testimony. And the veterans who came through their doors weren't just surviving. One afternoon, as Emily walked through the center's garden, she noticed a young man sitting on a bench, his posture slouched with the weight of an invisible burden. She approached him, her voice gentle. "First time here?" He nodded, his eyes downcast. Yeah." Emily sat beside him, her dog tags glinting in the sunlight. "Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to Parker's Haven." As the young man glanced at her, a flicker of hope crossed his face. In that moment, Emily knew the fight would never truly be over, but neither would the victories. Parker's Haven wasn't just a building, it was a legacy, built on resilience, compassion, and the belief that no one was ever beyond saving. And for Emily Parker, that was enough.